So here we have it, a heavily requested guide, the most powerful class in my opinion in Frosthaven, and that's just my take, but I think that here we have it, the Meteor, the Final Fantasy VII class. All I see when I see Meteors now is Sephiroth, Aerith, and Final Fantasy VII, or the inevitable death of dinosaurs again. But this dude, he looks like a badass, he is a badass, and some people have found it a little bit complex to play. So guess what? This is my most heavily requested guide from my patrons. So thank you for patrons. So without further ado, let's just jump into how to play this bad boy. Speaking of a patron requested guide, if you want to actually request own guides or other video requests, be sure to join Patreon. It really helps us out. But always, as per usual, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps. So as we can see here, this character has a mid health and a mid hand size. Nothing exceptional, just straight down the mid. 10 and his health starting at 8. Not thoroughly exceptional, nothing really to comment about here, and there's not a lot of... And there's no card mechanics that involve dealing its hand size. So you basically play this normally, except for the fact that there are several mechanics that it does get into. First off, obviously, you're going to be using the fire and earth elements. I think you're going to be heavily leaning more into fire. Not only does the color scheme kind of fit that, but just in general, there are some cards that lean more into earth, some that lean more into fire, and frankly, fire is just better. I think there's a general scheme where I think of the way it's supposed to be built, where you do first create fire and then interact with earth and stuff to cool it off and create this kind of cycle from fire to magma to stone. But it doesn't always play like that, and by always I mean I almost never played it like that. I just focused on fire, magma, and it works. You just kill things, and that's great. So the first thing I want to talk about is hazardous terrain. You actually get 6 extra tokens that come with your character. These are extra hazardous terrains that you can bring to the scenario, and they just look cute and fiery. However, that's your limit. That doesn't mean that once you create 6, that's all the hazardous terrain you can create in the scenario. It just means that any further hazardous terrain you create, you have to scoop up something you previously placed. In general, due to the volume of hazardous terrain you can create, you're usually, by the time you're trying to create your 7th, 8th, or whatever hazard, whatever the first and second one you laid are probably behind and no longer effective anyway. But there are some situations where I was going to put 7 hazards in one room, but that's incredibly uncommon. So for the most part, the maximum of 6 really doesn't impede you at all. I also want to note that if you have other ways of creating hazards, it does count towards your limit. But before we get into the guide, because we're talking about, oh no, hazardous terrains, and you can step into these, and the people are my allies are gonna hate me so much. Let's talk about Dormant Peace, the 3 check perk. Now some people are like, wow, 3 is a lot. This is very valuable. First off, for your own purposes, it's very strong. But if you're playing in a team of 3 or 4, it's exceptionally strong and very powerful. But if you're playing in a team of 2, you're good at dancing around your own lava, and let's say you have a Deathwalker, it's probably worth less. But due to the fact that there are 98% of the time this perk is going to be so powerful, I am designing this guide with the idea that everyone takes it immediately. Given the fact you're probably starting this character at maybe level 2 or something due to the time you unlock it, and you get 1 legacy perk, chances are you're either going to get it right off the bat, or it's going to be your first perk when you do get a perk. Most people don't unlock the Pyroclast until a little bit later anyway, so chances are you probably already have 3 perks to start with it. If you do pick these 3, it's the easiest. So to talk about what it does, clearly it says right here, Dormant Peace. Whenever you and your allies ignore dangerous terrain. Notice it says allies. This includes, because sometimes you can get really annoying if you wanted to drop hazards, obstacles, or traps with for example, a Bone Shaper who's doing lots of summons. Oh boy, that's annoying. Don't worry. All the summons can walk through this. All your friends can walk through this. You can walk through this. But this actually has a pretty critical and important facet to it. Most of the time when we're talking about negative hexes, people are trying to dodge in and out, and if you do toe the line, step into it and jump out, you're probably going to be suffering some damage. The fact that monster behavior follows a very specific set of rules, and you can control it around negative hexes, which hazards are, and the fact that allies can jump in and out without suffering any damage makes this a unique tool to this class that ultimately can result in huge ability to manipulate monster behavior to the point like that's strong. But not only that, but like despite the fact it has a lot of this level of control potentially, you also have a lot of damage, which is one of the reasons why I personally think this is probably the strongest class. Additionally, you have some crazy burst if you want to set it up that way, but for the most part, I'm not going to be talking about. I will be talking about crazy burst potential when we get to it, but for the most part, we're just going to be talking about how to play the class effectively and easily. But yeah, get Dormant Peace first. We'll talk about the rest of the perks later. So not only do you have hazardous terrain that you have to manipulate, you use fire and ice, you have a special limit to the hazards you can create, but also you have these negative trackers. The things where like normally like you see the drifter is like the next 6 times you make a melee attack add 2. Now this is like the next 3 times you start your turn take a damage. The next 3 moves you make get -1 to it. Like there's a lot of things with the Pyroclast that have negative effect like persistent abilities. The special thing about this is unlike most trackers, you can be like, well, I don't need this now, I'm going to drop it. You are not allowed to drop these negative persists until A, they fall off because you've triggered the correct number of turns, moves, attacks, whatever. So you either have to burn through the correct number of charges or you have to take a rest, a long or short rest. If you do rest, you can scoop up all the negative things. So often, if it wasn't very obvious at this point, you can like either short or long rest after like playing your whole hand. May play some of those high impact but like stuff with negative effects right before you long rest, and then just rest and then scoop it all up, and maybe you're like, oh crap, my next 3 moves have -1, but like you're gonna play this card right before you rest. You long rest, heal 2, scoop it back up. You didn't even move at all. You suffered no penalties from it. That's great. So that's just one example of way you can use to mitigate it, timing it, but that's going to be something we're going to be talking about as we go through card, noting that this has slightly special rules, unlike like normally where you could just dismiss them, unfortunately. So first thing I'm going to do is to go over the mechanics of zone control. All of these, again, assume you have Dormant Peace, so just take it. So in this picture, you can clearly see that you've put a magma under the enemy, or the enemy has stepped into one. We can use cards like Igneous Path, where we can potentially back up and create these obstacles, depending on how much the enemy is moving after you go and have created obstacles in your wake. They might no longer be able to get to you this turn. Alternatively, you could block off the path entirely here in an effort to just make them walk into it. If you bring their health low enough, they'll potentially just die on their way to you. Ultimately, the amount of movement the enemy has, the amount of health they have remaining might dictate where you want to place them. Because there's been several times where I like got living bones down to 2 health, and then I'm like, you know what, I could zone them off, but let's just block it all off to make them hey, walk towards me, and just they don't even worry about it. They'll step into the lava and die, and I don't need to worry about coming up with the creative pathing because I just killed them. But sometimes like, hey, this Chaos Demon has 18 health left. I can make him walk into this and take 2 damage. Maybe it might be better to find a way to just make that Chaos Demon just take a long path around and skip their turn, because you're not 2 damage isn't going to like expedite it so potentially so that you're going to just be able to, oh, we got this now. So sometimes you're going to want to effectively use the hazards to act as disarms rather than having them to act as damage. So you're going to have to get a little creative with that. So here's an example, one of my favorite cards I do like for both the top and the bottom, called Flowing Fire. But one of the things you can do as you approach enemies is, if you can see that this one creates potentially a line of lava, this guy's going to move too on his turn and just attack me. If you create magma and hazards in a line like this, now the enemy has to take a slightly different path to me, which now it no longer can get in melee, and it will skip its attack. Sometimes you'll actually want enemies to be on a specific path. There's some cards that say, hey, enemies need to multiple walls and multiple obstacles. You can potentially say, hey, I'm going to route you all into like the single path, and then leave one little gap beyond them. If you leave that one little gap, they're all going to try to single file down to this place and potentially skip some of their turns. Also, this potentially makes it very easy to set up another card under pressure, which requires them to be next to walls, and this is one easy way to set it up, while also kind of forcing them into a line, pile them in this way. Again, this doesn't work on like flying enemies, but for the most part, you have other ways of dealing with those. And initiative weaving. If you can see enemies are on the one side here, you can potentially like go in late on like you can coordinate this with your allies because they can move through lava as well. So jump on the lava, hit the guys, and then go early the next round, back out, and then force them to take their turn over there. You effectively got 2 turns in a row, which is typically what you normally want with initiative weaving, but now due to the fact that there's magma for them to deal with, you can potentially take 2 turns in a row with initiative weaving and then not get hit in the interim, which is one of the strongest points of this class. This is not something you're going to be doing very heavily reliably to the point, wow, I've locked all the enemies down all the time. No, you've got like move 5 chaos demons that are like only at level 3, I think they get level. Anyway, whole point is some enemies are going to get to you regardless. The whole point is this is only enough to mitigate some measure of attacks. You're not going to stop all the attacks this way. The whole point is mitigate some attacks and do lots of damage, but the zone control is going to add up to a lot, especially if you're playing on harder difficulties. So we're getting technically 4 builds here. I'm adding a build called Defender, which I'm not going to talk about until level 6 because I don't think playing a Defender style Pyroclast is, I don't think it's super viable, but once you get to level 6, you actually have some really good tools that you can use to mitigate incoming damage. We're going to be talking about a Striker build, which is basically built around mostly it's the Striker build, which is going to be mostly about, I want to hit things very hard, and you're going to be dropping some lava. And then there's going to be a controller build, which mostly is about object and like mostly hazard manipulation. Also, I'm going to mention something potentially hybrid, where I'm going to say something in between. So if I ever mention any like controller, hybrid, or Striker, that's what we're talking about, and then Defender we'll introduce later. There are lots of thoughts on strategy I have on how to play the class effectively, but first let's go through the cards and the perks, and then we'll get to some general strategy of how to do that. If you actually want to move between like general card thoughts, like here are the level 2 cards, level 3 cards, or here are the perks, or here's the strategy on how to play, check the bookmarks, and that'll guide you to the section that you need to see most. Cooling is a very cool card. Sorry about that. Cooling is really strong. I personally, most of the time, just use the bottom. However, I did end up using the top a little bit because it allows you, first off, use a hazardous tile and flip it to an obstacle. And this mostly doesn't affect things. You can't like make enemies suffer extra damage because they're on it because they have to be in an unoccupied hex, but you can turn an unoccupied hazard into one. Every enemy adjacent to it then suffers 2 damage, you get an experience, and you create earth. That's a lot in one card. Unfortunately, it's only suffer 2 damage, which isn't suffer to AMTs, but there's definitely some potential if you have an excessive amount of hazards out. Ultimately, because the fact that the other side of this card's useful, there are situations where you want to play this for this effect that just kind of pop up naturally over the course of a scenario. When you see it, it'll usually be like, hey, these enemies, I've got these 2 enemies that are low over here, or like, hey, those imps are annoying, but we need to deal with them, or in the case where most often like there's these enemies are low on health, and let's just go finish off a couple of them, or living spirits, specific enemies with high shield. That ended up being the most common use. Ultimately, though, with the late initiative means that this is something you can use for late if you want to go. Unfortunately, both halves of it aren't really conducive to actions you normally want to take when you're late. Because normally, if you really need to heal, you're going to want to go as early as possible. And that's what the bottom is. The bottom is, unfortunately, a bottom heal. I'd love top heals for this for some reason, but in this case, it's a bottom heal, which can be really effective, don't get me wrong. But then your next 3 moves have -1. Now, heal 5 is very strong. Heal 5 is the fact that you don't have much healing in your toolkit makes that the fact that not only this is a heal in your toolkit, but a strong heal, it's a lot. However, you have to time the fact that mobility is already a weak part of your toolkit, and hindering it more can be a problem. So at the most, you're going to want to possibly mitigate incoming damage and try to play this as close to a rest as possible, rather than forcing yourself to play this in the middle of fighting and then suffering a movement penalty because of it. However, because it is a significant, for a single action heal, non-loss, heal 5 cells, a non-loss heal 5 self on bottom is super strong. Yeah, so this is basically, in my opinion, for most of my, I don't know, I think I even got to like, yeah, I was using cooling in basically every scenario up to like level 7, I think. Yeah, this is one of your core cards. But primarily because of that. Although my group also had me basically forced to be frontline, so I think that probably has an effect on it as well as in testing. And often when testing, due to the nature of some classes, I haven't actually tested this class with basically a very tanky character. So it's possible that this card is less required if you have someone dedicated to taking hits. So if that's the case, bring it if you need the healing. Quenched Rage. This is an annoying card that I am really down on, or it's too powerful. I don't know how to put it. Like, if you don't have the right cards, this is a weak card. If you have the right cards, this card is insanely powerful. Quenched Rage is one card I really wanted to try out because push 3, when you have all this creation, can do so much. Also, if you infuse Earth, you can like double the damage. It's so powerful. Except there's so few times. There's nothing else baked into it. There's no attack. There's nothing else. So this entirely either A, you need Earth, and B, you need a certain amount of lined up things to make it worth it. And I've found out that most of the other ways of dealing damage ends up being just easier to use, or there's like fewer situations that like, I know like, hey, look at this. You can potentially do a lot of damage that breaks through shields for super shielded enemies. And sure. But like that doesn't mean you already have a Pierce 3 in your level 1 toolkit. That's very good and very easy to use and has like a very good general attack on, like, I don't know. I'm very down on the top of this because probably it might be a skill issue. Maybe I just never lined it up correctly and it's strong. But if I'm having trouble with it, I'm going to also assume that your standard player probably didn't actually get a lot of use out of it as well. So I'm going to leave it there. The bottom, on the other hand, is the linchpin in some of the big builds, including when I played this at high levels, I tried to break this with Cinder Lance, and turns out you kind of can, but that's a level 8 card. We'll get to it then. But let's talk about the bottom now. First off, you get 3 attacks at -1, and then you get 1 attack at double, and then it falls off. The 3 attacks at -1's super silly. You can obviously use effects like there's another card we're going to talk about, Metamorphic Rock, to push through that to get to the double faster. But you can also just kind of generally do weak attacks, and there's other ways you can do generally weaker attacks to try to push that out, and then hammer some of your big attacks in. And that's great, but you have to start getting used to the tempo of being able to get like multi-attacks out where you want to force these very quickly out, and then set up one big attack that you want to do in this fashion. So the whole point of what I'm trying to say is if all you do is finish this with an attack 3 and double it to a 6, you're basically using a bottom to get 0 effect. So most of the time you're going to want to get roughly a value of 3 from your bottoms that are like non-move bottoms. So you're going to have to find a way to line up an attack 6 for it to like basically be worth it. And the thing is, starting at level 3, reliable attack 6s start to happen. So this is one card I think that when at level 1 is actually not very strong, but once you get to level 3 and higher and you actually are setting it up correctly and deliberately, can actually be great. Like seriously, non-loss attack 12 is very easy to pull off at level 3. Just putting that out there. But some people say, hey, that's confusing, in which case, don't worry about it. But I will be talking about it at level, I think, 3, 6, or 7, and 8. I think it's 6. I probably screwed it up, but I know level 3 and level 8. Whole point is, if this card's confusing, don't take it. There's a lot of other good Pyroclast cards. Flowing Fire. This is one of your core cards because both halves are pretty strong. I think in general I lean towards the bottom. So first off, Initiative 20. I'm going to be very agitated about Pyroclast initiatives. This class in general doesn't gravitate towards early or late. You don't have extremely late initiatives. You do have some, but not enough. And you don't have enough extremely early cards, or the effects don't work well with it. It's funny, the fact that the cards are kind of not very good initiative-wise, that it's so good. The class is so strong. The bad initiative on the cards don't even make it. When I say it's so strong, it's still like weaker than the top 5 of Gloomhaven. So don't get me wrong there. But yeah, this is it's not, when I say it's the strongest class, I'm specifically talking about it from in scope of Frosthaven. But so the bottom is a move 6 at Initiative 20, which is incredible. And you're like, but you'll take potentially 3 damage over, and you're absolutely right. You could potentially take 3 damage over the next, this round and next 2 rounds. But you could mitigate that with either A, Metamorphic Rock, or B, Resting, or, you know, you can just do a little bit of healing and take the hits. Move 6s on command, even with non-loss move 6s on command, even with the drawback, has a lot of potential. The top, on the other hand, gives you potentially 1 or 2 attack 2s, which isn't great. But if you have fire, then you first off get an experience, and then every hex that wasn't used for the attack now becomes lava. And that gets really good for control. That's not your main force of creating lava, but most of the time I found out that the biggest thing I found for this is do roughly 2 to 3 damage, and then create 2 lava was the standard low level effect. And as you get to higher levels, it generally gets a little bit better because you have a very good attack modifier deck. So something to note, the extra lava that you create from the blank hexes sometimes is better to have blank hexes than trying to fill this up with all enemies. So that's just something to note. So, but ultimately, both halves of the card ends up being pretty useful. Most of the time I use the move 6, but sometimes if you need that extra magma, especially as a way to cut off the direct path and force them to take a slightly longer path, do it. Eruption. So this is a card I thought was really amazing at low levels because when I first saw this class, because I'm like, oh good, we have a bottom attack and a conditional loss. But it ends up only being good. Attack 2 and infuse fire on a bottom action. Oh my goodness. Honestly, there's so much fire generation and setting it up in other ways that I found it actually harder to actually use the fire on the bottom. For the most part, if I was set up correctly to be able to attack enemies, basically just use this as a bottom attack too. I really didn't have trouble creating fire enough. So yeah, I rarely got the fire. If ever, I may never have actually gotten use of the fire effect. But that doesn't matter because even then, bottom attack 2 is still good. The top, on the other hand, so despite the fact you have this bottom attack 2, the top is actually really situational. Like you're a 10-hand class, but sometimes you want to play high impact bosses because you have them. Like there's really annoying enemies. Living spirits can be super annoying. Depending on what form they're in, ice wraiths can be incredibly annoying. Wind demons, obviously annoying, and flame demons too. Eruption can actually do enough or significant amount of the damage because it's 4 suffer damage that breaks through shields. You create 1 obstacle, great. Then every occupied hex next to it, that obstacle first off creates a hazard underneath them, and then that person suffers 4 damage. You get 2 experience and then create fire and earth. There's so much packed into this action that it hoses shielded enemies when you need it. And I'm going to be honest, some of the things I hate most about like Frosthaven, Gloomhaven is sometimes dealing with enemies with high shield, and one of my favorite parts about the Pyroclast is it makes all those enemies very trivial. Not just because you have these kind of suffer damage effects, but you have a couple of easy access to pierce as well. So the Pyroclast is incredibly good at melting shielded enemies. This is one lost way to have high impact AoE. In general, I use this in like the second, and most often last room to just make it that much easier, and it reliably did. Just having direct damage, being able to toss it so far, and then being able to set up elements with it so you can then use the next turn. If you're like, well, if I had an element I could, don't worry, you do. Strong card, just take it for those. It definitely becomes kind of more part of a rotation as you get to higher levels. So it's not like a core card, but it's a strong card that you keep in your rotation and you will bring it to most scenarios. Speaking of core cards, Lava Bomb, this is a core card. It doesn't matter which side. I know, 53 initiative, what do you think of it? It's shit, but move 4, you at level 1 only have 1 move 4 that doesn't have a negative rider to it. There's another move 4 and there's the move 6 that we already talked about, but the other move 4 wounds you and the move 6 potentially makes you take 3 damage. So this is just a nice move 4. You're like, oh my goodness, I can move without hurting myself. Yay! Especially if you have cooling where you're like, oh god, I'm so slow now. This at least mitigates some of that. But for the most part, the fact this is your only non-negative move 4, the most of the time I'm using it for the top. So the top is very easy. It's an attack 2 at range 3, which is not super impressive, but you use the top so much that, by the way, you use the top so much that I'm almost sad that it has a square pip and not a diamond pip because you can make so much more out of it. But unfortunately, Isaac doesn't like fun. Actually, it's just too powerful because you use the top a lot. But attack 2 at range 3, but then also create a magma under the target's feet and then also infuse fire. That's the critical part. There's no setup, no gimmick, not like, well, if you have fire or if you have, this gives you, like, which do you want? Do you want fire or do you want the enemy to be standing in a hazard? This gives you both of those. You have a lot of cards that say, hey, do you have fire? You have a lot of cards that say, hey, is the enemy in a hazard? This is how you do it. You get both. You may not need both of them, but this gives you both of them reliably. And then an attack 2 to boot. Attack 2s are not super impressive, but the fact that this does an attack 2, creates a hazard, and infuses fire, all at range. I think it does a lot. Igneous Path. Hey, look at that Inish 18. Do you know I'm going to comment on it? Outside of one card that I'm not hugely fond of, yes, it has its purpose. This is basically your low initiative card. Oops. But Igneous Path, the top is very similar to Eruption's top, where, you create a loss effect and there's hazards and blah, And unlike Eruption, this one has to be a direct line and only does 3 damage instead of 4 and only infuses fire. Potentially can get you more experience, but the loss effect for this is primarily, save it for the last room, drop some damage out, and it'll pay off. This one, I think, generally you rotate out quicker than Eruption, but like the bottom still got super uses, and that's what we're going to talk about. So effectively, the bottom is move 1, and then the hex that you left becomes a hazard. Great. If you have fire, do that twice. Move 2, and then create 2 hazards, and you also get an experience. With fire, obviously doing it twice is better than doing it once. So that's primarily heavily, whereas like you have fire, what are you doing with this? Mostly this. Not gonna lie, I know it sounds like, what cool things can you do with it? Most of the time, Igneous Path, but you have a lot of other ways of creating magma, so this isn't like your main generator for it anyway. But a lot of times I'd like try to create a lava bomb, then create an Igneous Path to cut off paths, and then because I can use that and go late, and then use this to go early, and this ends up being kind of one of more critical ways to use it. Just in general, it's funny because sometimes you can also say, hey, I hit the enemies, now they're in my face, now punch them and move out, and like, by the way, in the process of me moving out, there's magma, bitch. In general, this is one of the best ways you can use to try to zone out enemies. It can potentially make their path longer, and because you have Dormant Peace, because you did take Dormant Peace, right, it doesn't screw with your allies too, which is great. Under Pressure, so Inish 85 strong, but mostly because you need the ability to go late sometimes. So I don't actually like either of these effects with the Inish 85, but you can still use it for that. So the bottom is a nice bottom loot. We're going to talk about that for a little bit because that's shorter. Bottom loot, but it also, instead of just only being a bottom loot, it does give you Earth, which is sometimes usable. There's a couple cards you're going to want that for, but it gives you Earth, and in addition to Earth, it also makes all adjacent enemies suffer damage. If the enemies are at 1 health, you can pair this with like a card, do that, and then get the loot immediately from them. Ultimately, I found this just to be, in general, harder to use. It was fine. The bottom's fine. I don't think it needs super elaboration on how to use it. Get loot, and you can use it to set up Earth if you need it. The top, on the other hand, is pretty great, because one thing I was talking about earlier is when you can screw with monster behavior pathing, if you do create so much obstacles, if you do create so much hazards that hazards or obstacles, I'm going to be honest, you're basically going to creating hazards most of the time and just a little, if any, obstacles. But you can create tiny pathways and force them to like go up against the wall. But sometimes in the process of going up against the wall, they're going to be adjacent to 2 different wall tiles and potentially obstacles. This makes it very easy to set up the top of this. Although this is only an attack 3, it's an attack 5 that gives you 1 experience. If you can just get them adjacent to 2 hexes with walls, which again, with lava makes it easy. So this is just straight up an attack 5 with 1 experience if you set this up fine. And I don't think it's hard. I found that getting them near 2 obstacles is actually harder unless the scenario is loaded with it. But trying to push them saying, hey, by the way, I dropped a bunch of lava. Now you have to go the long way around. The long way routes you to the wall. Hey, you're next to 2 wall hexes. Punch them. That's most of the time how I got this going, rather than trying to stack obstacles around them. Not gonna lie. I know, maybe that's the way it was designed, where you wanted to like turn these into obstacles and then cool, you do stuff. Nah, not gonna lie. Mostly go to the wall. By the way, take 5 or usually 6 or 7. It's fun. This is one of the cards that if you do want to use Quenched Rage correctly, where you're like, hey, set this up. This is one of the payoff cards where you can say, hey, I see you're next to the wall. I took a few weak hits there where I took -1. Now take an attack 10. That's all doable at level 1 too. So that's nice. People love non-loss attack 10s. But the card I prefer is this next one, Melted Armor, Initiative 62. So first off, Melted Armor on the bottom. Let's talk about that for a second. Almost always I use the top, but sometimes I use the bottom. It also depends on do you have a multi-attack setup? Because there is a card later levels that I did try. I wanted to like it more, but ultimately it turns out it was harder to set up to get all the elements as I wanted, but it was a target 3. Here's the funny part is this says on your next 3 attacks get +1, but then until you make these 3 attacks, all attacks targeting you get +1. So if you get surrounded with this in play, this can potentially be a huge amount of damage done to you. You can fall apart. So don't just drop this and be like, oh, I'm going to hit super hard for the next 3. And you could just melt. But you can use this very effectively to be like, hey, I've got a ranged attack, or I've got like a couple multi-attacks lined up, especially when you get free attacks from this like level 3 card. This can actually pay off pretty tremendously. But try to burn through the charges as quickly as possible if you are. Like the card Magma Orbs. This is one of the best ways to set it up where you're like, hey, I'm going to infuse these elements. I'm going to create Fire and Earth, and then now I have +1 to my next 3 attacks. And Magma Orbs, and boom, boom. Instead of 3 attack 3s, this is 3 attack 4s. So just burn through these as quickly as possible if you can, but that's primarily what you're going to be doing through the bottom. But the top, on the other hand, is an attack 3 that infuses fire. Attack 3 that infuses fire isn't great. But if the enemy is standing within a hazard, which is the easiest thing to do, like, guess what you can do? You can just say, hey, I lava bombed you. Okay, what does that mean now? That means you can melt armor on them. But that means that if they are standing in hazard, this isn't an attack 3 that infuses fire. This is an attack 4, pierce 3, that gives you 1 experience and infuses fire. Attack 4, pierce 3, 1 experience, infuse fire is very high on the pushed levels of a level 1 non-loss card, especially against like enemies that do have shield 3. Elite Living Spirits, this is an attack 7 on them. Huge. This card's just really strong. But again, you need to have it. It's mostly strong when you're fighting shielded enemies. So if there's fewer shielded enemies in a scenario, it clearly pays off less, because at that point you already have good ways to generate fire, and ultimately it's only an attack 4. So just bring it for the scenario that's appropriate. But for the most part, especially at lower levels, there's not a lot better than it. But don't worry, under pressure, like, if you're fighting enemies with no shield, under pressure will basically beat this out all the time, and that's going to be one of your bigger payoffs. But that one also rotates out once you more reliably as you get some of your harder hitting attacks. Liquid Stone is just a generally solid card. So Liquid Stone, Initiative 28 for like Pyro is like, this is fine. Like, it's not great, but like, you know, for your class, this is a good initiative, right? So the top and bottom both do like move 3 or an attack 3 that pushes the enemy. So attack 3, push 2. Here's the funny part. Attack 3, push 2 with nothing else on it is kind of, in the scope of things, a weak action, and I don't deny it. But with your toolkit and your attack modifier deck, an attack 3, push 2 is actually synergizes so well with your toolkit, because let's say you do create that really annoying hazard puzzle here, and then you Liquid Stone them, like, hey, by the way, thanks for walking the long way around. Now, not only did you take damage from being pushed across the line, but now it's such a long path back, because you realize you can take this non-hazardous path back to me. You can push them that way. Also, because the bottom also pushes 1, you very easily knock them into hazards, or if you have Earth, this is a move 3, push 3 on bottom, which is really strong with your toolkit. In general, both halves of this are really good, but I found the biggest thing, I found it like, oh, push 3. Imagine if I could. I didn't get the 3 hazards lined up. I'm going to be honest. I tried. But for the most part, I found the best thing to do was, like, I usually ended up accidentally creating lines of lava and then knocking them to the other side and forcing them to take these long paths back. And that's usually what I ended up using this for. Also, because you're pushing them through the line and you have a good modifier deck, I found this is very easily a good way. The top was often a 6 damage and then a disarm, effectively, because they had to move back. that was pretty normal, which is a really strong level 1 action if that wasn't it. So that's kind of how you're going to try to play around this. The bottom, on the other hand, like I said, move and then push them through kind of gets the same effect as well. But more often than not, I found I used the top a little bit more, but ultimately due to the initiative and the scope of the class and both effects, it's a good card in your toolkit. You're going to generally have it in your rotation most of scenarios. I think it really depends on what's in the scenario as well. If there's flyers, this obviously loses a huge amount of effect. Cloud of Ash. This is a card I wanted to use more, but it was hard to use. First off, you pick a hex with an obstacle. And the funny part is I used this in some scenarios that had larger obstacles. But destroy the obstacle, which is great. And then do an attack 1, push 1, muddle on every enemy next to that. And then you get an experience and infuse Earth. On an initiative 23. That's a lot, but unfortunately, due to the nature of these things, the attack 1s, pushes, and Earth and Muddle doesn't actually add up to usually most of the other actions. So in certain scenarios and certain situations, depending on party comp, it ends up being pretty decent, especially if there's like obstacles away. But I think for the most part, this card is just straight up harder to use, and there's just better ways to push out the damage. As a result, I think it's only okay. The bottom, on the other hand, is move 3, which is fine, but you can scoop hazards to turn them into obstacles, and if you do that, at least scoop 1 hazard up. This way, I think you can scoop up to 2. Yeah, up to 2, and replace them with obstacles. You get 1 experience and create Earth, which is pretty solid. For the most part, though, almost always you just want the hazards to remain hazards. This is pretty good setup if you do want experience in Earth, though, so it's because they'll still try to path around it, but sometimes you can't actually replace hazards with Earth. It depends on where they are. For example, if you're on an open door and you're like, cool, I'm going to block it off. No, you can't. You still, obstacle placement still must obey the rules, so you cannot replace an obstacle on a place that would actually like block off the whole scenario. As cool as that would be, although that would be very annoying to your allies, I'd say in general this card has some sideboard uses, but I think it's more of a rotational card that you're probably not going to get as much of a use out of. Sorry. Wildfire. So this is a card you're probably going to be using a bit. This is a card you're probably going to be using a bit. It is, however, it's a setup card because you have to A, destroy an adjacent hazard, which is sad, and it's a top action that does nothing. Sad. So it's a little bit of the cost and setups because a lot of times you want your top actions to be high impact. Luckily, though, there's no drawbacks after that. It's the next 3 attacks you make: inflict wound, inflict poison, and infuse fire. That's a lot. Also because the nature of how your class works, and you do a lot of pretty good attacks, and as you get to like level 3 and higher, you can potentially do multiple attacks per turn. Poison adds up significantly, so just keep that in mind. This, in general, due to the nature of how much damage you can get out of wound and poison, usually often adds up to more than 6 damage over the course of the scenario. So for the most part, this is more than 6 damage on a level 1 non-loss, which is good, but not like... It's very controlled because some cards have a very high ceiling, and this one, it depends on what the enemies are, but I found that it was good to use, but sometimes I didn't want the downtime setup turns to just do that, or like I'd want to do that, but then it would cause my hand size to be like lower between rest cycles to leave it in play. So as cool as I really wanted this card to be, it ended up only being above average most of the time, if not average. So you're going to bring this, and some groups it's going to pay off pretty well for. I think in general, if this is the playstyle that'll fit, adding poison and wound to your attacks is still really strong. Again, these are also things that are really good against shielded enemies, so you've got your whole toolkit hoses them. The bottom, on the other hand, is something I used a little bit more. Move 4 and wound 2 adjacent enemies and yourself. The wounding self is mandatory, so that's the only part. But move 4, wound self. Given the fact that you should probably bring some healing items, that's kind of some way to mitigate it. Hi, kitten. But that's not... I honestly didn't find the wound self to necessarily be that bad. I used the bottom a little bit more than the top, personally. Force of the Earth. Initiative 15, and I didn't like this card very much. going to be honest. So, like, although you can very much easily create hazards in front of you, a lot of times the pulls and pushes, I don't want the enemy to get closer. I want them to waste movement to get to me. I want them to walk towards me slowly. However, this can get those super annoying enemies like archers or stuff and try to pull them closer, and then it muddles them too, and that's great. But even then, with the pull, it only does an attack 1 as a rider on it. So, yeah, sure, it had an initiative 15, but I didn't end up liking this card very much. The bottom, on the other hand, you have to have an obstacle, not a hazard. An obstacle, and then your next 2 heals, which requires you to have 2 heals. This class doesn't have a lot of those, but for the most part, what I ended up using this is destroy an obstacle, and then the next time you long rest, you heal 5 instead. And that's pretty strong. But you also use this with cooling and other stuff that I'm like, cool. I tried to get it to work, and it was good, but like, not gonna lie, more often than not, I just found myself a little bit more annoyed with using this card and ended up relying on other forms of healing instead of it. So, if you get better use out of this card, just rub it in my face and say, haha, I did it, okay? Because I really wanted to, because I wanted to make the 15 work, but oh boy, I couldn't. Metamorphic Rock, on the other hand, was very easy to use. The 68 initiative is a little bit better because you can go later than most annoying cards, but it's very simple. Push an annoying effect on any of your cards back, like that, hey, take 1 damage when you start your turn, or hey, get -1 to your moves, or stuff like that. Check one of them off and move 3. It's very basic, but it's pretty good. Wow, this video is going to be super long. I did not anticipate I'm going to talk about this forever. But the top is very interesting because unlike so many classes, like, for example, the Drifter or the Banner Spear, that top action is busted. That would be so broken on those classes. So why do we get it here? Not only do we get it, but we get no negative rider. We don't, like, it's not for the next 6 attacks you get this. It's not, you get this, but then -1 to all the range. There's no penalty. It's straight up shield oneself, retaliate oneself, give an element that you want to experience. The Pyroclast Toolkit and perks, the cards don't synergize very well with this at all. So, whereas like with the Banner Spear, this could potentially be really strong. It's not actually that great on the Pyro, which sounds great because a lot of it sounds confusing, but it's just hard to use. And frankly, despite the fact that this should be a card that's great on many classes, for you, most of the time you might not even want to bring this card at all. This card gets more useful once we get to Obsidian Shield at level 6, and we'll certainly talk about it then. But for the most part, I don't think this is a card that you are bringing to most scenarios, or if you are, you're bringing it for the bottom. Because move 3 going later than normal and then pushing one of your trackers back is actually pretty good to use, but the rest of it just isn't there. So, for the most part, most people are going to be playing the hybrid build here, or the controller build. So first off, looking at the controller build, these are primarily the cards that I stuck with, your more main cards, and this is more of the hybrid. The hybrid's probably going to be taking those. And the striker, mostly once you get to level 2 and higher, will dictate what cards you end up picking. But this is primarily what you lean into. For strategy, most of the striker is just going to be, I want to do damage, and the controller says, I want to drop obstacles and or mostly hazards to manipulate monster movements. For the most part, I kind of played a hybrid build anyway, and I say that it's probably just the core best way to play the class in the first place. At this point, we're going to be talking about the level 2 and higher cards, so let's just dig into it. Searing Smoke. So ignore everything. The bottom is a jump 4. Well, that says some other text at the bottom. Jump 4. You have no jump in your toolkit at all. And now not only do you have a move 4, you have a move 4 on one card that wounds you. You have a move 4 on one card that's tied to one of your best non-lost tops. And you have a move 6 on another card that makes you take 3 damage. So a move 4 that does another bonus good effect and has jump is a really good card. For most builds, I'm just going to put it out there, if you take this card and ignore the other level 2 card and ignore the top of this and only take this for the jump 4, it's a good choice. So I'm going to talk about Deep Fury in the top of this, but if you're ever like, I don't know, or mobility problems are a thing, if you take this only for the bottom, you will get good use out of it. That's just the bottom line, and I think that's perfectly a viable pick. Sometimes you just need mobility, and this class suffers from it, and this is one of your first band-aids for it. Naturally, to continue talking about it, it also muddles every enemy that you jump over during the movement. I don't think that's very critical. Maybe sometime during the scenario, this will change one disadvantage roll to save 1 or 2 damage. So for the most part, you're going to be using it just for the fact that it says jump 4. The attack, on the other hand, requires fire and earth, and you can potentially get 2 experience on a non-loss. The earth, I don't think, adds a lot. It gives you an experience for sure. It muddles all adjacent enemies, which is fine, but for the most part, that's not something you're going for, and that's fine. The turning the attack 2 on all adjacent enemies into attack 3 on all adjacent enemies is, however, pretty strong. So I'd say, given the fact that you have several fire generators, use that to do it and hit all the adjacent enemies for attack 3. And if you want to muddle them, that works too. But don't try so hard to like set up the earth correctly. This is another way that you can use this with Quenched Rage to say like, hey, I'm going to do a bunch of like attacks now, and then that's going to push it right over into the double period and then set that up for an attack 10 under pressure. So just a heads up, this is one of the quick ways to burn through those charges. Although like, oh, well, they turned those attack 3s into attack 2s. I'm sure they're fine. And then your other option is Deep Fury. Deep Fury is one card that I really wanted to love. I'm like, oh, this is going to be the best. It's good, but it's not as powerful as I anticipated. It's healings on both sides, though. But let's talk about the top. The top is an attack 3, but you have to occupy the hazardous terrain, which I thought was pretty easy. But I found out this is actually more annoying than anticipated. And I almost rarely got to use the effect unless I also paired it with Igneous Path. And I'd be like, I'm going to walk over to this enemy. I'm standing in this. And now I'm going to, since I walked to the other side of them, push them through the hazard. But at that point, it becomes an attack 4, push 2, 1 experience, heal 2 self, which is a really strong action. So that's good, but I was certain that I was going to drop so many hazard that this is going to pay off immensely. And it only paid off like, you have to get the hazard on the correct side of them, because there's usually not hazards behind the enemy unless you move around them. So you have to be a little bit more deliberate and creative with that, in my opinion. That said, I still think the top is a good card. 38 initiative is not, I'm not a fan of that. The bottom, on the other hand, is definitely hilarious. Heal 3 self is fine, but also on your next attack, targeting an enemy that's in a hazardous terrain, double it. So use this with just to drop a hazard on an enemy and then double it. This is very easy a way to get +4/5 on an attack if you're just feeling lazy, especially on a final room, to say, hey, I'm gonna get +5 to this attack 5 and I'm gonna heal myself for 3 because we're fighting this annoying boss, or there's an elite and I'm burning through stuff for experience. This is one good way to use it because the top is super in general good for the scenario, but this also both of these come in at the cost of losing a very easy access jump 4. So like I said, I really do like Deep Fury, but there's so many times where I've used this with Searing Smoke that I'm like, Searing Smoke was the right choice. So I think for the most part, most builds pick Searing Smoke for both the hybrid and the controller. I think the striker picks Deep Fury just because it has the higher damage potential. Also, if you do get Quenched Rage and then set up Deep Fury correctly and like, hey, double the attack value, do the math yourself. Again, level 2. Hey, I'm level 2. What can I do? Non-loss attack 20. This is technically a loss because even though Quenched Rage is a non-loss, Deep Fury is a loss, so I wouldn't consider that non-loss. But be sure to bring ways to give yourself advantage because you don't want to draw a null on that kind of crap. So like I said, Deep Fury for the striker, and all other builds pick Searing Smoke. Living Magma. Okay, so I like Living Magma a lot. Honestly, both cards at level 3 are super annoyingly good. Just putting it out there, both these cards are good, and I don't think it does not matter which card you pick. Living Magma is really strong for a couple reasons. Number one, there's actually a lot of ice spikes as hazardous terrain in Frosthaven, and there's a lot of shielded enemies. And it's funny how many times you have scenarios that have shielded enemies and ice spikes that you can like this isn't living magma, but I'm going to make those living ice spikes now start to attack the thing next to them, and then watch as things start to fall apart or like start to wound various enemies over the course of a thing. But it says at now, and then at the start of your next 2 turns, perform the following action: attack 1, pierce 2, wound, infuse fire, target 1 enemy that's occupying or adjacent to hazardous terrain. That's a lot. That gives you, first off, for the first turn, attack 1, pierce 2, wound is not super great for a level 3 card, but being able to do it then the turn after, and then getting an experience on the second turn there is big. That's big. That adds up to a significant amount of damage, especially if you're fighting shielded enemies, and we found ourselves doing that quite a bit. And I'm like, man, because we'd fight enemies where, oh crap, these are annoying. I'm like, no, they're not. Don't worry. I have them. They're going to die so fast. So, yeah, I'm really strong on this card if it wasn't very obvious. But the bottom's also, see, here's the annoying part. Both halves of this card are just great. Bottom's a move 1, which isn't great. Pick 1 magma that's adjacent to you, and then move it up to 2. Now, the moving it up to 2 is cool because, first off, it does say that if this walk moves through an enemy, they'll suffer the damage. But if you're in melee with an enemy and you've created some hazards, you can then move away, move the enemy through them, and potentially change the path that they have to take to get to you. Most often than not, this isn't going to be affecting you too much. But like, for example, frozen corpses, which sometimes will only do a move 1. Now suddenly, like, oh, I'm going to back up 1. And now they have a 2 path to get to you, and they suffered 2 damage in the process. And that was just your bottom action. You still could have done a top action for like an attack 4 as well. So it's a very easy way to effectively disarm people by moving stuff around and doing some damage. Also, the funny part is, like, we found like if we have enemies that are like at low health and we don't want to waste an attack on them, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to keep fighting this, but then this lava is going to move on to that guy at 2 health, and now he's just dead. He turns into loot. That's another reason why we used it. So using it to zone out people, using it to either weaken enemies to make them easier, or to finish off enemies without having to burn an attack. Because like, oh crap, the guy only needs a little bit, so as long as I don't draw a null. This doesn't draw a null, it also just straight up does damage. Keep in mind though, this says that if this enters a hex of the figure, they suffer hazardous terrain damage. Flying does not protect enemies from this, so if you need ways to like, oh well, I don't know, this flying enemy, dude, just move the magma through them with this. It will make them suffer the 2 or 3 damage, or 4 if you're playing on high difficulties. So it's really strong. Hardened Spike. First off, ignoring everything else on the card, it's just an attack 5. Non-conditional attack 5. But guess what? If they are in hazardous terrain, which is very easy to do, this is attack 6, gain an experience. Attack 6, gain an experience, infuse earth. Oh man, not only that, but initiate 80, which is something you could do for initiative control. That's huge. Again, Quenched Rage. If you're setting this up correctly and you do like, hey, I'm going to Searing Smoke, do 3 attacks, and now I'm going to set up Hardened Spike with Quenched Rage, and now I'm going to do an attack 12 on you. Die. Yes, this is it. This is it. This is it. I love this. You know, of course, like, hey, there's a drawback on it. Yeah, you suffer 1 damage and over the next 2 turns. Sure. But, like, let's be real here. This has a very high ceiling on the damage. So, like I said, Living Magma gives you a couple of, like, weak attack 1s and pierce 2. This is burst damage. I know, personally, I really like Living Magma. But let's be real here, the burst damage on Hardened Spike is really hard to turn down. So if you do want to get the Quenched Rage combo, this is one of your best payouts for it. Additionally, the bottom half is also really good for burst damage. So it's adjacent to an obstacle, right? Yeah, move 3, and then attack 1, targeting an enemy adjacent to an obstacle. So attack +1, rather. So all you have to do is get an obstacle next to them, have them move next to an obstacle. You might be able to route their path with magma to get towards one. You might be able to create one, but like I said, Cloud of Ash is one good way you can do to just say, hey, I created some magma, you have to avoid it. Now I'm going to turn that magma into an obstacle, and it's very easy to be adjacent to an obstacle if you can just turn any of the hazards into it. This is one easy way to do it. But if you have Earth, which, you know, Cloud of Ash gives you not only Earth, but gives you an obstacle. But this is one easy way to do. All right, I used Cloud of Ash to turn this into an obstacle, but now I'm using the bottom of this to turn that obstacle into, and Earth into me getting +3 on my next attack against you. which is a lot. Unfortunately, the fact you can't give +3 to the top of Hardened Spike is the real sadness here, but don't worry, you have plenty of other effects that you're probably going to be using this on. So that's one of the reasons I found Cloud of Ash to be effective, is because I do like Hardened Spike and it pairs very well with the bottom of it. But most of the time, I'd say if you are bringing Hardened Spike, you're almost always bringing it for the top anyway. Striker build goes for Hardened Spike. Hybrid and Controller both go for Living Magma, although I think that the Hybrid build could also go for Hardened Spike perfectly just fine as well, because frankly, if you just need to do some obstacle manipulation, or the fact that you have better Earth generation than the Controller build, Hardened Spike is a really good payoff for you in the first place anyway, so I wouldn't mind picking that either. Level 4, Hand of Flame. So this card basically does everything you want in the first place. So let's just talk about the top. The top is an attack 4, but then it also muddles the enemy. It also infuses fire. It also gives you an experience. It also creates magma under the target. So that's what you want. You want experience. You want to muddle the enemy because you don't have good armor. An attack 4 is pretty solid. But not only that, but it's an attack 4 with no riders on it. There's no conditional stuff. So you're like, hey, take 4, and usually because your modifier deck, more than that. But here, take 4, congratulations, this is great, hooray. But not only that, but it's muddle and 1 experience and magma and fire. Boom. That's good. Initiative 29 is fine for the pyro as well. The bottom, on the other hand, gives you another attack, but instead of infusing fire, it wounds. And that's notably better than infusing fire, because you have a lot of ways to infuse fire as is. I personally think that it doesn't matter which side of the card, you're probably going to be using the top more often. It's just easy to use. I do think that the skill ceiling on Hand of Flame is a little bit lower, but it's so much packed on that top half, I think it's hard to complain about. On the other hand, you have Heat Wave, and Heat Wave, hey, look at that initiative, it's an 8. It's an 8. You're a pyro class, and you have an initiative 8, and you celebrate, but not really. So let's talk about the bottom for a second. Move 2, but then you turn that infused fire into 1 obstacle and 1 earth. And you can use the earth on a later turn. But more often than not, you don't need obstacles as much as you need hazards. So this is kind of hard to set a good use for that anyway. Initiate, and then you're like, well, maybe if I had a good move or some other buff effect, it's just hard to get the good use out of that bottom. But the top is definitely where it is, but all adjacent enemies suffer 2 damage, which is perfectly fine, but you have other ways to make enemies suffer damage. But then it's a push on all enemies within range 3 of a push 2, which can definitely add up to a lot. And if you have fire, it's actually a push 3 on all enemies. So that's a fairly strong action. And then, assuming you don't short rest, basically, or Metamorphic Rock could load it up that way, at the start of your next turn, you're just going to suffer 2 damage. In general, I found this to be harder to actually get equivalent payouts to Hand of Flame. And Hand of Flame has the versatility where if you're in the right position, you can use a good top half anyway, and then just attack with another attack 2 with wound to do some good amount of damage. I just found Heat Wave harder to use. You can still load up a room with hazards and have a payout on it. So I'm not saying Heat Wave's a bad card, but you can definitely pick it just for the initiative, and it's got some good control. I personally think that most builds are just going to pick Hand of Flame. I do think that if you are a controller that actually has first off, if let's say you're avoiding the initiative 30 and under card, except for the 22 and 18 from Igneous Path and Flowing Fire, you might bring this solely to get the initiative 8, which is a really good undercut as is. But if you're a controller build, the Heat Wave might be up your style. But like I said, controllers probably would also pick Hand of Flame. Obviously, hybrid builds and strikers pick Hand of Flame. Level 5! So this is Magma Orbs. Magma Orbs is one of the best ways you can, if you have Fire and Earth, you can burn through 3 charges really quickly. So hold on. Attack 3, range 3, target 2. But if you have Fire and Earth, it's target 3 instead. So that's attack 3, range 3, target 3, which sounds familiar. That's Fire Orbs. But this is Magma Orbs. So, yeah, instead of giving you fire, this one requires Fire and Earth to get the full effect. But this one's not a loss. So that's, I think, a pretty notable difference. So, yeah, Magma Orbs you can potentially get very easy attack 3, target 3 with this, but unlike Searing Smoke, this one can do it at range 3 than having to try to pile them all up in melee. The initiative 82 is very good for initiative weaving, so especially if you're trying to get the enemies to move forward. Like I said, this is one of the best ways to, if you are going through to try to do the Quenched Rage spike with Hardened Spike or with Under Pressure. I think at this point, at this level, you don't go for the Under Pressure, you just go for Hardened Spike. It's easier to set up. But you use this with Magma Orbs, do 3 attack 2s instead, and then Quenched Rage, Hardened Spike for an attack 12. That's just an easy attack cycle, and you can do that every rest. Easy mode. 3 attack 2s, and then get an attack 12. Be sure to give yourself advantage or strengthen somehow. Just a heads up, because that's going to be mega important. If you do have a Vigor Potion, this is the turn to play it, where you do the 2 attack 3s, or the 3 attack 2s, because you actually have a really good in deck that can potentially like either knock enemies away or potentially create other hazards or other cool effects. And then also because you drank it during your turn, you gain strength during your turn, you can then use it to have it still in effect when you do the attack 12 on the turn after. So this is the turn to play it. The bottom on the other hand is perfectly fine. Create an obstacle adjacent to you and then pull an enemy within range 2 up to range 1. Which is perfectly fine. This is a very easy way to do 3 damage or 2 damage depending on what level the scenario is, or 4. You know, hazardous terrain damage. It's a very easy way to do that. Personally, I think that the bottom's fine and the top's fine. I really wanted to like the card more than I have, but then there's Rain of Fire. Rain of Fire is your other level 5 card. It should look very similar to Craghart's Rock Slide, but there's one pretty big difference. So this one is create 2 hazards within range 3. And then any enemy occupying or adjacent to them suffers 1 damage. And you get an experience. So something I want to point out here is the fact that you can drop it under their feet. Now, they don't suffer hazardous terrain for it being created under their feet, but you have so many cards that have the thing of, if the enemy is occupying hazardous terrain, do this. Hey, guess what? Boom. Have some fire. Notice it says featureless, not empty. So that just means things with no features. So things without traps, things without water, things without obstacles. So just say, hey, fire's beneath your feet, and then everything adjacent to that and around those tiles all suffer 1 damage and you get an experience. Initiative 21 is also pretty good. And then let's talk about the bottom. Jump 5. If you didn't take Searing Smoke at level 2, you were definitely taking Rain of Fire, because jump 5. Because you're taking it for the jump 5. I feel like I don't need to elaborate more on that. That's good. Striker picks Magma Orbs to set that up. Ultimately, though, if you just want it for the jump, the Striker also picks just Rain of Fire. But if you do want to set up Quenched Rage very easily, you do go for Magma Orbs. The controller also goes for Rain of Fire. Level 6. So we're going to talk about Obsidian Shield and introduce the new build Defender. So on the next 4 sources of damage from attacks, you gain Shield. So if you have Metamorphic Rock in play, the top of it, you can potentially have Shield 2 for 4 attacks in a row. And then on the 4th attack, the attacking enemy suffers 5 damage and you create an obstacle next to them. And you get an experience. So this is pretty good because, first off, obviously, effectively, a Retaliate 0, Retaliate 0, Retaliate 0, Retaliate 5 is really strong. Shield 1, Shield 1, Shield 1, Shield 1 is pretty fine as well. This doesn't have any other conditions saying like, hey, they need to be adjacent to you, they need to be in hazards. This is just take 4 hits. But of course you have to take 4 hits. So if you're going to take 4 hits, what do you need to do? Mitigate damage. What's the best way to mitigate damage? Shield. Do you have a persistent shield? Yes. Pair this with Metamorphic Rock and watch as this becomes Shield 2, Shield 2, Shield 2. Shield 2. So that's 4 attacks in a row. You get Shield 2. And then you retaliate 1 for the first 3 and retaliate 6 for the last one. Bring some healing. This is another way you can use Force of the Earth because you can destroy an adjacent obstacle, which you create with the final charge of Obsidian Shield to add to your next few heals. So you can say, hey, cool, I'm going to cooling for 8 and then long rest for 5. Mitigate the damage and go through the cycle again. So this kind of makes it to where you're more of a tanky character. Use this with your hazard and fire creation. Like use Cloud of Ash and Hardened Spike, create the obstacles, create annoying paths so he can only fight 1 enemy at a time, and then watch as these enemies, and then find ways to give them disadvantage by like muddling them, and watch as you actually become the tank of the group. Again, this is really only viable once you hit level 6, so that's the nice part about this. The bottom is also very tanky, and also it's got a niche 19, which is perfectly fine. The bottom is also very tanky. you either A, suffer 2 damage or destroy an adjacent obstacle. Again, like I said, if you're playing these other builds, you probably are creating more obstacles. But you have to suffer 2 damage or destroy an adjacent obstacle. And then you create Earth, and you also, guess what you get to do? You get to ignore the next source of damage done to you. So even if you are going the tanky build, the bottom of this is super useful for you. That's this card. In general, I'm going to say only this new Defender build takes it. And the other builds, all the other builds are taking the other level 6 card, Return to the Source. So let's talk about that card now. Return to the Source. So first off, I hate that effect where it says the next enemy that would suffer damage from hazardous terrain suffers no damage. Keep in mind there's a divider there, so it doesn't happen instantly. So initiative 14, which is great. That's one of your best undercuts you have in the game. But not only that, but it's on a good card. But attack 3, range 4, pull 3. So that happens first. So if you do have hazards already laid out, this pull actually still triggers the hazards. Then the next time a hazardous terrain would affect an enemy, it doesn't. But keep in mind, initiative 14 is usually good, and range 4, pull 3 is usually enough to pull those really annoying ranged enemies towards you. And you can usually follow this up with like a bottom attack to like, hey, attack 3, pull you through these, bottom attack, you're dead. And then you can possibly potentially make an enemy like suffer damage that doesn't, or you can like wait for this to like long rest and then let this fall off without preventing the damage. But ultimately an initiative 14, attack 3, range 4, pull 3 is a lot for your toolkit. And not only that, but it does also set up fire, which is something that you can use for a couple of effects. Like I said, I usually have enough fire generators that it's not a big deal. This is one of those. So move 4, ignore hazards. Ignore hazards doesn't matter because you took Dormant Peace, but then you also heal equal to the number of hazards you left. This is most often equals to Initiative 14, move 4, heal 1 or 2. I rarely ever, I don't think I've ever mucked through 3 hexes, not gonna lie. Yeah, but healing 1 or 2 with it also is really good if you just need to move and heal off poison, because frankly, cooling is really great, but the most annoying part is you have this big heal and then saying, "Oh, I'm poisoned," so that big heal just got wasted. This class is very vulnerable to it. This is one way you can shake it off. So worst case scenario is you have a good move on a good initiative that now gives you good initiative control and can potentially heal you or knock off poison, but also you could potentially be able to pull some particularly annoying ranged enemies towards you in melee, and that's already good enough as is. So every build picks this card except for the new tank build, which picks Obsidian Shield. Let's go to level 7. So we will talk about Erupting Rage, but I'm going to just say it now. I'm not a big fan of it. I think the Defender picks Erupting Rage and no one else does. So let's talk about Erupting Rage. So attack 4, pierce 2, and then during this push, you can knock enemies into obstacles during this push. If you do, for every hex they enter that's an obstacle, replace that obstacle with a magma or a hazard, and then they suffer hazardous terrain damage. So the problem is you need to have obstacles placed. But again, the Obsidian Shield guy, that build, has a much better way to generate obstacles than the main builds. Most of the time you're just going to be dropping hazards as is. So for the most part, you don't use that. However, this is one good way to say, oh, I just hit this enemy, it fell off, the shield fell off, and now I'm slightly more vulnerable, but hey, I just dropped an obstacle. I'm going to push you through the obstacle. Now that obstacle's a hazard and you suffered a bunch of damage. It's a good way to deal with it. The bottom is still really good, a good effect. Create a hazard, move 3, create a hazard. Hard to complain about that. The initiative 70 is fine. It's late enough that it's kind of late, but not late enough that it hits after some of the more annoying attacks. So that's perfectly fine. I do think, and we'll talk about it later, controllers could possibly pick it just for the bottom, and you'd probably still be happy. But let's look at Swelter, which is one of my favorite cards of this. I like Swelter. Pick a hazardous terrain within range 4, remove it. Oh, that's sad. Then targeting that hex and every enemy next to that hex. So this is kind of like a 7 hex attack pattern. Do an attack 3, range 5, pierce 2. Target everything in that 7 hex pattern and then infuse fire and gain an experience. That's strong. all you have to do is have a hazard in the right tile. Like, you can drop hazards really easily as is. The initiative 32 is fine, but let's be real here. This is one of the best ways to do this. If you place this correctly and target this, this is one of the best ways you can to burn through charges to set up Quenched Rage as well. So if you really wanted to, you could Quenched Rage with this, do 3 attack 2s, pierce 2. So just 3 attack 2, pierce 2s, and then set up the next turn for a attack 12 hardened spike. This is one of the ways you can do it. Just saying. Also, like I said, because this class has a lot of cool effects on its attack modifier deck, doing this while popping a Vigor Potion, giving yourself strength, is huge. If I haven't said this already, Vigor Potion I think is one of the best cards for this. So the bottom is a loss, which I think is super powerful. Up to a maximum of 5. Every enemy in the same room as you suffers damage equal to the number of hazards in the room. So this basically is fill the room with 5 hazards. Then everything in this, usually the last room is when I play this. Everything in the same room as you suffers 5 damage. And also keep in mind, this isn't like the Spellweaver's Inferno. This is all enemies, not allies. So this doesn't even have friendly fire. All enemies in the same room. This basically says all enemies suffer 5 damage. Of course, you do need to set up, but let's be real here. If you're playing if you did take Rain of Fire, Hand of Flame, it only takes a couple turns to set this up, and you get yourself 5 hazards in the room, blow it up. And then you still have a top action along with this. It's very easy to pull out some large amounts of damage here. So every build picks Swelter. If you're a controller, you might pick Erupting Rage for the bottom. The defender picks Erupting Rage. But I personally think Swelter is one of the best ways you can do it. Also, once we get to the level 9 card, you can see it's 2 losses, but you can pick 1 level 9 card in Swelter and just melt a final room. Like, it's ridiculous. Level 8, Feed the Beast and Cinder Lance. Let's talk about Feed the Beast first.
The top of it's a little interesting because you have to pick a hex within range 3 that contains a hazard, a hex within 1 that contains an obstacle, then create 2 hazards adjacent to the hazard you picked and destroy that obstacle. Then, in those new hazards, if an enemy is in any of them, they suffer 5 damage and you gain an experience. This seems like the payoff's pretty nice. Although suffer 5 damage, it's only 5 for a level 8 card, but it is suffer. So for like annoying steel automatons, this can be really nice. But also for flame demons, this is especially good at dealing with those really annoying high shield enemies. So fantastic, especially because flame demons have like no health anyway. But in this instance, you have to have an obstacle. An obstacle creation just doesn't pay off nearly as much, and you have to have while you have an obstacle adjacent to you, you need to have enemies adjacent to a hazard, and that hazard, so it's just generally harder to set up. But if you can get 2 enemies adjacent to a single hazard and have that obstacle, you can absolutely get this rolling. So, not a big fan of that top. The bottom, on the other hand, is still really good. Just move 2, destroy an adjacent hazard. If you do, the next attack you make this round also causes the target to suffer hazardous terrain. It doesn't add that to the attack, so it's not doubled on a crit. But on the other hand, because I do the damage, and then you suffer hazard, that suffer damage ignores shield, so you can potentially just say, hey, well, it doesn't matter, I'm going to do an attack at range, and congratulations, you're going to take another 3 or 4 damage from this. Keep in mind it says next attack, not next attack action, so you can't just magma orbs and make everything suffer extra. I know, initially I was like, oh, I got excited for a second. I know, I'm sad. On the other hand, you have Cinder Lance. Initiative 90 is good for initiative weaving. Move 2, attack 3 is fine. At worst, this is basically a bottom attack 3. That's the worst case scenario. But move 2, attack 3, and potentially be able to line it up. When you do line it up, it is really cool because that can do a lot. But you also, it's a move and an attack. I know some people are like, oh, bottom attacks are cool if you're positioned correctly. Congratulations, you have the repositioning and you have the attack built in on the same thing. This is a fantastic card. But mostly for the top. I know the top will damage yourself, but oh boy. Attack 4, which is not good for a level 8. But then if you burn fire, it's an attack 6. If you burn earth, it's an attack 6. If you burn both, it's an attack 8. So if you Quenched Rage and set this up, this is a non-loss attack 16. Yep, all you have to do is like magma orbs, get the 3 charges out, do this for an attack 16. And yeah, you suffer 3 damage, but like you're already suffering 3 damage for like Hardened Spike.
The problem is this one requires you to set up 2 elements, which I don't think is that hard, especially because Quenched Rage gives you the more annoying element to set up Earth. It's very easy to set up another action with the like Living Magma or literally anything else for fire, and then having this double the next thing. Also, because of that, if you do need to use Living Magma, you can say, hey, because you didn't get the elements, you can use Quenched Rage, get the other 2 effects, get 2 attacks out, and create Earth. Living Magma, and then Living Magma will get the last charge of it done. Also create Fire, and then you still have Earth from the previous turn, and then do, boom, Fire and Earth. That's literally, without any conditionals set up, a way to do with 2 turn setup, attack 16. And in the process of getting this 2 turn setup, attack 16, you also get an attack 1 wound and attack 0 wound, both with Pierce 2 in the interim. So, and then you still have a bottom action to pair with that. So you can guess that you can use the bottom of Deep Fury to turn that 16 into an attack 32. Like I said, Vigor Potion, give yourself advantage. Find ways to give yourself advantage. Honestly, that was one of my favorite potions to use. So, so the Striker picks Cinder Lance for obvious reasons, because if you're going to do a lot of damage, that's how you do it. And the Defender picks Feed the Beast, and Controller picks Feed the Beast as well. I think for the hybrid build, you can go either way. I'd probably lean towards Cinder Lance. Last but not least, Stone Armor and Calamity at level 9. Stone Armor obviously goes to the Defender build, and I personally think every other build goes for Calamity, so let's just talk about the Stone Armor right now. Initiative 9 is great. So it's a permanent effect that infuses Earth and gives you 2 experience, but it's level 9, so whatever. Whenever you take damage adjacent to an obstacle, destroy the obstacle and you can take no damage. You can also skip it, so if you're like, hey, I'm taking an attack, oh, we drew a negative and blah, blah, okay, so I only suffer 2. You're not maybe going to say, like, maybe I don't want to destroy the obstacle. But sometimes if you're taking crits or any number of hits or whatever, at any point in time, if you're adjacent to an obstacle, destroy the obstacle and take no damage. You can just do this as long as obstacles are adjacent to you. As long as you can create more obstacles, you can potentially take fewer damage. That's really strong. You might use this instead of Metamorphic Rock and say, hey, we're going to find ways to create and drop more obstacles, and we're just going to try to abuse Stone Armor this way. It's really good. The bottom, on the other hand, is a jump 3 shield, where shield is adjacent to the doesn't have walls. Yeah, I was gonna say jump 3, and then shield equal to the number of objectives and obstacles next to you. So this is one good way to really stack it with the build. Even if you didn't want to use the top of Stone Armor for that effect, the bottom is a good way to actually add shields to your effect with Metamorphic Rock and Obsidian Shield. You can potentially be very annoyingly invulnerable for a turn. Calamity, on the other hand, is a top loss that says create 3 in the same room as you, create 3 hazards, create 3 obstacles, and then every enemy in this room suffers 4 damage. If you have fire, you create 5 hazards instead. If you have earth, you create 5 obstacles instead. And if you have both, you create up to 5 of each. Keep in mind it says up to, so you don't actually need to drop 10 tiles, especially if you're like, hey, I don't want these annoying things. But you can potentially just completely screw over a whole room and do 4 damage. So this is what I was saying. Calamity and Swelter, create, if you have fire in play, that's all you need to have it set up. Is there fire in play? If so, everything in this room suffers 9 damage and you get 5 hazards. Win. That's just a win. Not only that, there's no, like, you don't need to get strengthened. You don't, oh no, I draw a null. It's just suffer 9 damage. So that's really good. But again, that's burning 2 losses. But again, so what I was pointing out is the top of Swelter is really good. So when you bring the bottom, that you're like, well, the conditional bottom. Don't worry, the top's good. So this Calamity's top is really good. But is the bottom something you're going to use? The answer is yes. It's a non-loss bottom, thankfully. All enemies in the same room as you perform a move 1, but you control the moves. Given the amount of hazards that you can create, this actually can add up, especially at this level where they're going to do at least 3 damage, but 4 damage due to hazards. You can actually add up to, on a bottom action, a lot of potential damage, or potentially move enemies like one, if they're like barely in range, you could potentially move them 1 hex out of range just to do this. And this is every enemy that's sharing the same room as you. So that's huge. So like I said, everyone picks Calamity except for the Defender build, which picks Stone Armor. All right, it's perk time. So, first off, Dormant Peace. You and your allies are unaffected by hazardous terrain you create. You pick it. As long as you create the terrain, you and your friends are immune to it. That's all it takes. And I know it takes 3, but it's absolutely worth it. Like I said earlier in the video, you're taking it. I don't need to elaborate on it more. I usually pick ignore scenario effects pretty early on because the last thing you want to do is add more negatives or curses to your deck, and that's a lot of it what it is. Or there are some disarms or some annoying stuff. The whole point is Frosthaven has a variety of annoying things. I always pick this. Next thing is you want to start removing the negatives. Getting the -2 out of the way I think is pretty critical, especially if you are going to be doing those big heavy hits. The last thing you want to do is to get a -2 on it. And then you remove the -1s. So it takes 2 perks, and all you do is remove, and it's not replace the -2 with anything, it's just straight up remove the -2. So for 2 perks, you remove 2 -1s and a -2. Perfect. But then you have the ability to replace -1s with +0, create a hazard. And that one's actually really strong too. So that one's a very easy pick. And I think the controller picks that instantly. I do think that in general, the controller's probably going to be replacing the 0s with the pushes. And I think the other ones, the striker bells is going to be more leaning towards add +1 wounds. But also at the same time, if you're going the defender build, being able to destroy an obstacle when you long rest to ward yourself is probably a really strong pick as well, because ward pairs really well with being able to shield to yourself, because then that means basically most attacks are going to be mitigated so much and then warded cut in half again that by the time you're level 6, that's going to mean every time you long rest, you're going to usually eat up another 2 more damage. So it's a really good heal plus a ward. And you'll have a lot of obstacles next to you anyway. I personally don't like the short rest perk. I think that you have to short rest with fire active, and then you just wound one enemy that's next to it. It's fine. I long rested long enough that I didn't end up, I don't know. It was perfectly fine. I do think personally that the striker also replaces +1 with +2s, especially if you are going for like eagle eye goggles and yeah, if you're going for eagle eye goggles and vigor potions, you're going to have lots of advantage. And advantage pairs more off of having highs than having a consistent number. So replace the 1s with 2s and then start to just optimize your deck more. I personally think you only add the +1 fire earth if that's until later, because honestly, once you start to really optimize your deck, adding more +1s doesn't necessarily improve it as replacing the +0s, which I think adds to more damage, or replacing the +1s or adding more rolling cards. But keep in mind there's a rolling +1 muddle in there. So I think that for all builds, this is the first thing you want to start with, and then I think most builds are going to start to deviate after you've taken these core perks. So some strategies things, I want to point out that when you do move between rooms, one of the things you want to do is try to put hazards in there as much as possible. Once you're level 4, I found out one of the easiest ways to do that is to run into the room with another movement card and then using Hand of Flame, and that usually is one of the best ways to try to go as late as possible, jump in there, Hand of Flame, get them standing in lava, and then pair it with another card. Alternatively, you can use Lava Bomb to do that as well. That's a little bit easier to use, but slightly less damage throughput. But get hazards in the new room as quickly as possible. Both of these create fire, so you're going to be able to use Igneous Path on the follow-up to then back out and create lava to screw with their path after that. So that's a pretty easy way to do that. And often you can either A, make the path to where there's only lava to get to you, or B, make it to where the path to you that isn't with lava so long that you might be able to avoid the attack to begin with. Initiative weaving, I personally think, is extra important for Pyroclast just because of your ability to do what I said. And Igneous Path is a good enough undercut that for most of the time, you're going to go early enough that you can back out and create lava. But you can do this very easy to like, hey, I'm going to lava bomb that guy. Now it's standing in lava. Next turn, I'm going to melted armor, or I'm going to hardened spike on it, and then Igneous Path out. And because I Igneous Path out, I've now moved 2 or 3 if you boots. And now during this whole movement, I've created this path of lava. And you can create, and you don't need to create single paths back, but you can be like one over here, and then create annoying lava paths that way. But the whole point is, fill up the new room with lava as much as possible. The floor is lava. Despite the fact I'm talking about like room control and zoning things out, and there's some things that manipulate obstacles, I do think obstacles are very much lower priority. If not, there were some scenarios where I don't think I even used obstacle interaction at all. And if you're like, hey, I'm mostly using hazards and obstacles, you probably are still doing it correctly. Despite the fact that there's like a lot of things that are like suffer 2 damage, suffer 1 damage, suffer hazardous terrain, and it's only like small things. Never in large amounts. It adds up to a lot. That's why I'm like not down on living magma, because at the very least, like the worst case scenario on it is like I'm gonna move 1 and then like do another 2 damage to them, and that's the like a low. That's a low tier on the bottom, is a move 1 and suffer 2, which I think is a pretty decent thing with the bottom. But usually you can also use it as a, hey, I'm going to move back 1 into this hazard, and then the hazard next to me is going to move up, change the path of the enemy, and make it suffer 2, or stuff like that. You can do some annoying stuff with this, but I haven't often found ways to make living magma completely like ignored, unless the enemy has like really low movement. But for the most part, being able to manipulate hazards for effects is super useful. But also raw damage adds up a lot. Just suffer damage. Just a heads up. When I said that you don't have many like loss actions, that means don't be afraid to use those loss actions in the later rooms, because frankly, unlike a lot of other classes, you have 10 cards, but not a lot of losses. If you've looked, the number of loss actions on your class in general is so tiny compared to other classes. As a result, you probably have really good longevity. I personally never really had longevity, even when I was playing aggressive with losses. And when I did play aggressive with losses, I found that I was more able to fill rooms with lava and were able to punch through. As a matter of fact, I think this was the Pyroclast on my long IRL campaign was probably some of the easiest streak of scenarios we had. Not because the scenarios were easy, but because me playing aggressively on the Pyro resulted in a lot of effort being done up front that just trivialized scenarios. Maybe I'm just good. Also, keep in mind, don't be like too static on these build options. I personally think that anything I say works for the hybrid build, works well for basically any build. You don't need to necessarily focus on these, but I'm kind of just giving you, hey, here's a playstyle idea, and these are rough ideas. If you do say, hey, I've been kind of going for this kind of idea, but I want the other card, almost always, unless I'm saying I'm down on it or I don't like the card, it's usually a good pick. This class has a lot of options. As long as you use the card effectively, it's hard not to. I think it really boils down to like once you get to level 2 through 4, the only difference is I found that the Hand of Flame was way easier to use than Heat Wave, but both the other 2 and 3 cards both are super useful, and I honestly think that this class just has a lot of good cards no matter which way you go. They're really good. Masteries. So the most annoying part about that is the move enemies through 6 different hexes of hazardous terrain that's created by you. The big part about this is you have to actually create the things and then move 6 different hexes. So you have to find ways to do lots of pushes in this. One of the best ways you can do this is to create Igneous Path. If you do have a big line of enemies, if you do have a very linear thing in a scenario, you can use Igneous Path to line stuff up if you have 2 enemies at the back of the path. As long as you create a path that's like roughly 4 wide, 4 across, you can use level 1 cards, Quenched Rage, Living Stone. Quenched Rage to move 1 enemy through them, and then move up to the next enemy, move it, and boom, that's 6 hexes. The easiest way to do that is level 9 Calamity is probably the easiest way to do it. Just move every enemy in the room. As long as you create 5 hexes of fire or something like that, that all you have to do is use the bottom of Calamity and then any other push effect or pull effect or anything. It's just that easy. The biggest part about this is you're going to definitely have to use multiple pushes and pulls. There is also an item that I'm not going to call it by name, but there is a pull. But if you can have an enemy that's really far away, pull them and then do a push 3 onto them, that's honestly one of the best ways I've found to get this as well. The last thing is create a hazardous terrain every round. There are some scenarios that have like timers. If you can kind of create, do a little bit of a timer, you can very easily generate fire every turn, but this does require you to place things correctly. So you have to leave Igneous Path out, you have to leave... So you have to like, if you do take like, for example, Hand of Flame, and then you can use Hand of Flame, Lava Bomb, and Igneous Path, 1, 2, 3, and that's 3 turns in a row of creating hazards, and then it just becomes a matter of using your other losses like Eruption or something to fill the gaps, and or using Rain of Fire or Magma Orbs in the gap to fill that. And just constantly doing that, be sure to short rest. There is one scenario that usually can be done in about 6 rounds or less. And there's some scenarios that say, hey, this ends at like the 10th or 12th round. These are some of the scenarios that are probably high for that. Also, because your longevity is really high, here's the funny part. On any of those scenarios that only last like 10 or 12 rounds, this is one of the best ways to get these scenarios because you don't have a lot of losses. A lot of your losses are high impact, and almost all of your losses outside of a couple do create hazards anyway. So you can use this as a way to mitigate the fact that, oh, here's my non-loss hazard, here's my non-loss hazard, and just use that as a gap fill, short rest, and then get those non-losses back and just keep that going. That's just my thoughts on the Mastery. I got that one pretty handily, and the other one took some effort during FROSTHAVEN testing. I know. I'll admit defeat. I did not get the other Mastery during my actual campaign. So sorry, Pyroclast. I failed you. So that's it. That covers the general strategy of how I played. It goes over zone control. I went over the cards and perks and a little bit on the Masteries. So hopefully this helped. I know I talked for a long time, but hey, holy crap, that was a lot. But hey, Pyroclast was one of the classes I did enjoy when this class was initially released. I won't go into too much details in FROSTHAVEN testing. It had a different hand size, and I felt like, man, I was just really struggling. Dormant Peace wasn't on the perk list. It just was hard to play this class effectively, and it was a real struggle bus. And I kind of made it my effort to be like, I would like to provide some feedback. So there was a lot of early shaping of it that I saw from where it started and how it turned up, and I feel really close to it. So it was a lot of times probably why I talked too much about it, but then after I got to play it on my current campaign, it's just been a joy, and I really enjoy the class. So I hope others will be able to better use it to get some of those powerful combos, especially like the high attack Cinder Lances, or just maybe just blow up a whole room and fill it with lava. So what's your favorite card? If you have played it, if you haven't played it, what are you most excited about? And let me know. So if you like these guides, I'm going to put up a patron poll for the next class soon. And if you do want to join our Patreon, you'll get to be able to help pick what the next class that I'm going to do a guide on for FROSTHAVEN. So if that's important to you, be sure to join Patreon. And additionally, the support really helps. Speaking of Patreon, thank you to all of our INX tier patrons. In the past year, I know I've only had this channel for like 3 years, but the past year, like not even year, like 9 months, the patron list has skyrocketed. So thank you, all of you, so much. This really means a lot. I didn't anticipate getting past 50. 50 patrons feels like a lot to me. I mostly just do this very casually. I'm not a very heavy streamer, and it just means a lot. And you guys are amazing. So thank all of you so much, and thank you for watching.